Hello, I'm Andre Sistini. I'm the Principal Planning Officer at Mendip District Council, and we're going to take you through some of the key points in the planning white paper. I've got my colleagues Joe Milling and Rob Palmer, who are also from the planning policy team. This presentation is a variation of one which was presented to members on the 23rd of September. We're going to probably cover the current national planning consultations to reform the planning system, and I'm going to also cover how you can make responses to that. There are links to the consultations and briefing notes on our planning policy consultation page, and the address is there. And when we make responses to the consultation, they'll also be published on that page. So just to run through, there are two really main consultations which are currently underway. One is the planning white paper, which is the main topic for this presentation. It contains high-level proposals to reform the planning system, and they're very significant. And that closes at the end of October. And the changes in that paper won't happen straight away. They're going to come in place over the next couple of years. It requires a new planning act, new planning guidance. And I think we're saying if you've got a view on planning, you should really read it yourself and respond to it if possible. Now, there's also a second consultation, which closes shortly on the 1st of October. That's called Changes to the Current Planning System. That's very much about short-term measures, which we'd expect to come into force really between now and December. And there is a briefing note which explains on our website, which explains the main proposals as part of that, but I will cover those. If you're viewing this presentation after the 1st of October, there should also be a response on our website. It's also fair to say there are other consultations and other changes going on which are not in these papers, the most significant being changes to permitted development rights and the use classes order. And there are other consultations affecting housing and housing delivery, and also to building regulations at the same time. But we're going to focus on the planning white paper and this paper on short-term changes. So in terms of the short-term paper, and I'm going to go through this very quickly because there is more detail on the website, the principal changes are to the national top-down housing targets. These have had a lot of attention in the last few years because they affect 5-year supply and also Mendip's 5-year supply target. Some changes to affordable housing requirements, and what the government is looking to do is temporarily to remove the requirement for all schemes over 10 units to provide affordable housing, and raise that to either 40 or 50 dwellings. There are also some proposals to do with the government's first homes scheme. Now, first homes are discounted homes, so they do count as affordable housing for local first-time buyers. And again, the questions, that's not something that's ready to come in to be introduced straight away. Those questions are largely around the fact that the government want to make the first 25% of affordable housing first homes. And the questions asked in this paper are about what freedoms the council has to negotiate the other types of affordable on the scheme. And then there's also some proposals to introduce what they call permission in principle for major sites. It's something that's a bit restricted at the moment. In short, that won't affect Mendip so much. It's a kind of streamlined process of getting a certainty that a site could be developed for housing. But because we have a lot of designations in our area, that's not going to be applying to Mendip. So the most controversial aspect of the changes paper are the revisions to what's called the standard method. You might have heard some discussion in the news describing this as an algorithm. It is one of those as well, but essentially it's the top-down numbers which are set as targets for each local authority in the country, and they are used to set the 5-year housing land supply, where if you have an older plan, and they're also used in a measure called the housing delivery test, which looks at how many houses have been delivered over the last 3 years against the targets against the national targets. Now, the point of the standard method is to really push councils where affordability is worst. So effectively, they're saying that the more difficult it is for people to afford a house in your area, the more councils should be doing to increase the supply of homes and release land for development. There have been problems with the standard method, particularly because although it relies on national statistics, in fact, the distribution of growth around the country has resulted in quite a number of metropolitan authorities in the north seeing their numbers go down, and other, largely in the southeast and the Midlands and other areas, the numbers go up. And the government promised to look at this again and try and rebalance the figures. Those proposals have resulted in a new formula which is put out for consultation, but in my view actually makes it much worse for rural areas because they've added an extra amount for affordability. So at the moment, whereas that number, the government number, is 600 a year, it's going to rise to 1,060 a year. Now, to be fair, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have to build 1,000 houses a year, but it's the starting point for the next local plan. So I'm going to now turn to the housing white paper and say a little bit as an introduction, and then I'm going to hand over to Joe to take you through the 3 main parts of the consultation paper. Starting in terms of where government are coming from, it's very clear what they think about the planning system. It's broken as far as they're concerned, too complicated, takes too long to produce plans, and what they're really looking for is a system that creates far more certainty. Certainty for developers, perhaps certainty for communities, and a move away from case-by-case assessment of planning applications. They've also highlighted in their paper that people no longer trust the planning system anymore. There are concerns about the quality of what's being built, with very few examples that people can point to as being particularly good. And I suppose the 2 other major concerns is, one is that they'd like to see more opportunities for small builders. They can see the problems where only a handful of large developers dominate the market. And another feature of one of their main aims, of course, is trying to increase the supply of homes so that there are more opportunities for younger households to actually get on the housing ladder. And ultimately, their main criticism is just not enough houses are being built. The planning system isn't working to make that possible. So I'm going to hand over to Joe now and talk about the first of the 3 key areas that are the focus of the white paper.
So the first pillar focuses on the local plan, and the system is much more focused on an early engagement through the local plan process. But rather than the style of plan that we have now, it will be more zonal based. So there will be all land will be put into 3 different zones, either for growth, renewal or protection. And in the growth zone, schemes will be deemed to have outline consent at the point at which the local plan is adopted. And these will be areas for large scale development, urban extensions, redevelopment sites and so on. The renewal areas will have a presumption in favour of development, and these are effectively the built-up areas where you might today see infill and so on. And that area will include design codes and standards, but not policies. And in the protection areas, development will be restricted. So these will be areas like green belts and areas of outstanding natural beauty, and we think it will also include quite a lot of countryside, although that isn't yet clear. So the local plan will use digital maps to specify those zones, and will be a simplified document from the ones that we've been used to. Here we are. So the local plans won't contain any policies at all. So that will all relate to a revised national planning policy framework which will guide development, but it will include design codes and standards. So there'll be almost like a pattern book for those areas where development is it already has permission effectively. And sustainable development will be retained as an underlying principle, but with a very much simplified approach. So the environmental assessment process will be replaced, and there will be quite far-reaching changes to the duty to cooperate, which will be on a much more strategic and need to cooperate basis. And there'll also be binding requirements for housing numbers, which will be based on historic affordability, constraints in the area, brownfield opportunities, and the requirement for land for non-residential uses. And there will be a very much streamlined development management process. So in the growth areas, outline consent will be conferred by the adoption of the local plan, and then all that a developer will need to do is to confirm details. So there'll either be a reformed reserved matters application, or where the local planning authority wants to take the lead, then a local development order can be prepared. There'll also be a route through development consent orders, but that's only for the very largest schemes and is unlikely to affect us in Mendip. Within the renewal areas, there's a presumption in favour of development. So there will be pre-specified forms of development which will get automatic consent. So that's your sort of pattern book type of approach. And then for other things, there'll be a faster planning application process. And again, the local development order or neighbourhood development order, if either the local planning authority or the parish council want to take a lead. And in the protected areas, very similar application process to what we have at the moment, but applications will be judged against the new National Planning Policy Framework rather than a series of policies in the local plan. Okay, and now I'll hand over to Rob, who will take us through Pillar 2, which looks at the creation of those pattern books, those design codes and standards.
Thank you, Jo. Pillar 2 is design and beauty. Now, by design, we're not referring only to the visual quality and the layout of new developments, but also to the functionality and livability. So currently, we have local design policies within the local plan, and also generic policies covering design within the NPPF. Now, the white paper proposes a new national design framework. This will include the existing National Design Guide, which is based on 10 characteristics of good design, such as identity and build form. But this will be supplemented by something called the National Model Design Code. Now, this is due to be published this autumn and is potentially going to be much more prescriptive. This is based on the findings of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, and both of these together will set a baseline standard of quality and practice across England, which local planning authorities will be expected to take into account when developing any local design codes or when determining planning applications. In addition to this, there'll be a revamped manual for streets, which will be revised and consolidated. So in the future, local planning authorities will be expected to defer to both the National Design Guide and the National Model Design Code in the absence of any local design guidance. So the local design guidance will be the requirement of a new local design framework, and this is one of the big ticket items within the white paper. This introduces local design codes and pattern books. Now, these are technical documents which set specific design rules that new developments must abide by. They must reflect local character, and they must be provably locally popular. They'll be based on an understanding of the local context, character, and identity. And ideally, they will set the conditions for design, but not necessarily the design itself. Now, they have to reflect local community preferences, with local communities being able to contribute to influence what designs they would be happy with in their area. So there'll be a need to satisfy the public through public engagement, as they must have community input in order to be valid. So this is aimed at giving local authorities the ability to ensure that any new homes conform to local residents' ideas of beauty whilst also being sustainable and supportive of other public objectives. So we'll have to consider how this will be achieved. We'll need to be mindful of what is popular design. Is it simply design that sells well, which may not necessarily be good design or be beautiful? And there'll also be questions on where's the room for innovation and how will diversity be encouraged. Now, at an even more local scale is site-specific master plans. Now, these would be within the designated growth zones. They'd be prepared either by the local planning authority or by a site promoter, and they'll be a condition of any automatic permission. They don't need to necessarily be hugely detailed, and they could involve the use of what they call pair-backed coordinating codes, which set a clear and concise design parameters such as density, scale, and massing, which means to guide more detailed design work later on. And it could also involve the greater use of design review panels at an early stage. Now, moving on to the next slide. Excuse me. The white paper introduces a fast track for beauty. Now, this is whereby schemes will comply with local design guides and codes will move through the planning process much more quickly, and introduces pattern books in the renewal areas. This will allow, it is seen, the pre-approval of popular designs through permitted development. So, for example, your pattern book or design code could promote a particular design of house, which therefore may not require planning permission. Now, the white paper also proposes a chief officer for design and placemaking to be in every local authority. We don't know the specific details at this stage, but they're likely to be separate to the chief planning officer or their equivalent. And all of the above will be supported by a new national design body. This is going to be tasked with driving up design standards and supporting local communities and authorities to produce design codes. The government's also looking to achieve improvements in energy efficiency standards, where new homes will produce 80% lower CO2 emissions compared to current levels, and every home will be capable of becoming fully zero carbon without further retrofitting, and all new streets will be expected to be tree lined. So this is something which is likely to feature quite heavily within the forthcoming model design code. And finally, there will be updated guidance on heritage assets. This will possibly simplify the consent process and also look at how the historic environment can help address climate change. And there may also be a renewed drive to extend and improve local listing. Now, all of this will require quite a radical culture change within local authorities and significant investment to increase in our in-house design skills. So we need to get a lot more familiar with the concept of design codes and how exactly they can be best be used to make popular, well-designed places. And we'll also have to be much more proactive, especially with regards to our community involvement. I'm going to pass you on to Andre now. He's going to cover Pillar 3.
Thank you, Rob. I'm now going to turn to the third element of the Planning Policy White Paper, which covers development contributions. And in this case, the government are looking to replace the existing use of legal agreements, known as Section 106, and the Community Infrastructure Levy, which is a charge based on new floor space, with a single national infrastructure levy. Now that abbreviates to NIL, which is a clever use of an acronym, but essentially they see this as a much more simple system that avoids the very lengthy negotiations there is associated with certainly Section 106. Now the infrastructure levy will be very different from the current developer contributions because it's going to be based on the final market value of development. So effectively it's a roof tax, and it's also going to be applicable to all types of development. So at the moment where there's a change of use, or the permitted development rights allow you to create new dwellings, they're not covered by Section 106 or SIL, whereas the new levy will cover those types of development. At the moment, the government will decide nationally what the rates for the national infrastructure levy are, and they promise further consultation on this, but at the moment they won't be decided locally. And of course that does give rise to concerns. There's huge variation in development values and house prices across the country, So they will have to be sensitively set if they're going to be effective. So that's the three pillars. What I was going to do is very quickly just pull out some of the issues of interest to Mendip in terms of our concerns. Firstly, climate change. We're a climate change authority, declared a climate change emergency. And the white paper does make some commitments around, as you heard earlier, around more efficient development and the role of climate change in placemaking. But we'll have to wait and see in terms of the actual detail of that. It is fair to say that the government is looking at the building regulations to take quite a lot of the workload rather than planning policies. In terms of affordable housing, again, not a lot of detail, and I think we do have concerns about the balance from the new levy being able to pay for both affordable housing and other infrastructure as well. Again, we don't have the detail, but there's certainly a concern about whether we'll be able to deliver as much from the new system as the government promise. Neighbourhood plans, also an issue of interest to us. Government have made it clear that they are seen as a valuable local plan making vehicle, that they do have they're particularly good at engaging local communities in what they want to see in their area, and they should be retained. What's not clear is where they fit into the definition of these three areas for growth, renewal and restraint. So we'd be wanting to see early clarification, because it's difficult for communities to start on a neighbourhood plan without knowing where it might sit in these wider reforms. And then lastly, just to think about what is a real change is the balance between public engagement in planning now, which is largely at planning application stage. That's when people are most interested, and what the white paper is proposing, which is engagement much earlier in the process when the local plan is being prepared. And essentially the idea is that, let's say there's in a growth area, there's more engagement on the master plan up front, with the hope that those proposals are acceptable when they come to a streamlined decision-making process, because they've been through engagement to start with. It's also fair to say the white paper doesn't cover everything. I think a lot of us are concerned by its almost exclusive focus on housing. Doesn't say a great deal about town centres or employment land or land for gypsies and travellers, which is important in Mendip. So these are all issues which we'd need further detail on. And then put there is this white paper really tackling what's important? I think that's a useful issue to think about if you're making your own response. There's a lot of focus on design and if you like, the external appearance of buildings. Is that the really important issue, or is it more house space and what new dwellings can provide? And also that issue around moving towards a system where we're no longer weighing up the harms and benefits of a scheme and coming to a decision at planning board in the same way. If those things are important to you, they might be severely curtailed in the new system, and that will be worth writing into government about. So to wrap up, I think it's a paper which has something for everybody. It is a radical change. It's not just an evolution from where we are now. There's a lot of, as I say, it's a high-level paper, which means that there's a lot of issues where we don't have the detail. It's not possible for us to tell you what this is going to look like, because this consultation is being used for people to make suggestions. There's real concerns about the timetable. The government would really like new plans to be in place by 2024. I think we've got real concerns whether that is practical or achievable. And I'd stress again, try and read the white paper if you can. Certainly if you've got any interest in the planning system, it's worth having a look what they're saying. These opportunities don't come around very often, which involving a fundamental change to planning, and submit a response. And the last slide should have details of how you can do that. On behalf of the team, thank you very much for watching, and further details will be on our website on the Planning Policy Consultations page. Thank you.